Welcome, friends, to an extra special episode of A VGM Journey. And I'm your host, The Messenger. The track that we're playing into today's show is the main theme from the game Shovel Knight, and it was composed by Jake Kaufman. For the last 3 years, A VGM Journey has participated in the video game music podcast community-wide event called Masters of VGM, where we covered composers that we thought of was the best of the best. And that each year had a different theme, and it was really cool to see what the other podcasts thought of was, well, the best of the best. And though the first event was, I would say, a huge success, I mean, so many podcasts participated in it that it was just really crazy to me. But the following events had less and less podcasts participating, and I believe due to different life circumstances and also the lack of interest, led to Masters of VGM not coming back for 2025, which was really disappointing for me. And it definitely seemed like it was a disappointment for both St. John of Nerd Noise Radio and Professor Tom of the Shujin Academy VGM Club. And with a little bit of discussion and a bit of inspiration from Heat Override of the Bring the Pain podcast, we decided on a new event called the VGM Hall of Fame, where podcasts induct a video game soundtrack to this Hall of Fame. And with a lot of consideration for the game that a VGM Journey was going to induct into this VGM Hall of Fame, there was definitely a handful of games that I heavily considered for this VGM Hall of Fame, and that I am proudly decided to go with Shovel Knight, a really cool indie NES throwback game that did wind up becoming widely popular, and the soundtrack, as you'll see, or as you'll hear, will be absolutely amazing. I also thought it made a lot of sense for Shovel Knight to be the first game that a VGM Journey selects for the VGM Hall of Fame, because the soundtrack was composed by Jake Kaufman, who appeared on the very first Masters of VGM episode for a VGM Journey, and it had some additional tracks that were composed by Manami Matsumae, who's also appeared on Masters of VGM for a VGM Journey, specifically the Masters of VGM episode from 2024, which focused on female composers. I think this is weirdly the most talking I've ever done for an intro for a VGM Journey, so I'm thinking let's get into some music. And we're going to kick off this first block with Strike the Earth, the Plains of Passage theme, and then we're going to follow that up with the Starlit Wilds, also known as the Campfire scene. those two tracks that you just heard, they were Strike the Earth and the Starlit Wilds from the game Shovel Knight. That is how you start off a game. So in my honest opinion, Strike the Earth is one of the best themes for an opening level to a game ever. And it's a high energy track that definitely gets me pumped up for an epic adventure. And I also find the level itself to be really well made too, where you can use your shovel to dig up treasure, clear out obstacles, and even fight some enemies too. And Shovel Knight even has a down thrust move pretty similar to Link from Zelda 2 or Scrooge McDuck from DuckTales. And after you conquer the level and beat the level boss, you get to play this scene where Starlit Wilds plays, where it's a campfire scene where Shovel Knight is sleeping and he has a dream where he has to save Shield Knight, his friend, who is falling from the top of the screen, and you have to catch her. The first instance of this scene, it's just a white background, and it's just you, and she's falling down, all you gotta do is catch her. But as you progress through the game, more and more starts to happen, and like you'll be fighting off enemies, and it gets pretty crazy. And the reason why he keeps having these dreams is because long ago, Shovel Knight and Shield Knight, they went on adventures, and they went to this tower where some really bad stuff happens, and Shield Knight gets taken away. Then the tower disappears, but then reappears sometime later, and an evil force that is led by the Enchantress and her Order of No Quarter start causing a lot of trouble throughout the land. So Shovel Knight goes out to stop them and rescue Shield Knight. We're going to move on to our next block, which is consisted of some stages and also the village theme. So we're going to start off with In the Halls of the Usurper, followed by High Above the Land. After that will be La Danse Macabre, and then we're going to end that off with No Weapons Here. That block that we just listened to started off with In the Halls of the Usurper, followed by High Above the Land. After that was La Danse Macabre, and then we ended that off with No Weapons Here. When it comes to the various stage themes, I don't really think there's a single dud among them, but I did specifically go for some of my favorites in this block. I think for tracks like In the Halls of the Usurper, it starts off pretty big, but then kind of scales back a little bit, but still has that driving sound where you are working your way through this castle to take on King Knight, one of the members of the Order of No Quarter. And though he acts like he is royalty, he's actually a false king. And I feel like it kind of reflects that onto the track too. Then we got High Above the Land, which is the theme for Propeller Knight's stage. And I love the intro for the track because it sounds like it's taking you up in the air, but because of the propellers spinning around, it kind of cuts into the music a little bit. And it's such a cool effect that I don't think I've really heard too much in 8-bit music, but it definitely adds into the atmosphere. And then with La Danse Macabre, I know that's a fan favorite of a lot of people. So it does have a sense of spookiness to it, but it's mostly a jam too, as you're working your way through this cemetery to take on Spectre Knight, who's like kind of a Grim Reaper type. And in between the stages, you could go to this village where the No Weapons Here track plays in. And though there are a couple different versions of this track, I decided to go with the basic normal version. And I absolutely love how cinematic sounding this track is. Despite just being a pretty laid back situation where you're talking to villagers and playing some mini games or even buying things. And I really think that tracks like these really showcase that this soundtrack is one of Jake Kaufman's best and very deserving to be inducted into the VGM Hall of Fame. We're going to move on to our next block. And though Jake Kaufman was the primary composer for this game, and that he worked on, I would say, about 90% of the soundtrack, there were a couple tracks that were composed by Manami Matsumae, who I would say is best known for being the composer of the original Mega Man. And that she really did come up with some fire tracks. So we're going to listen to 1,000 Leagues Below, and then going to follow that up with Flowers of Antimony. Those two tracks that you guys just listened to, they were A Thousand Leagues Below and Flowers of Antimony. And both of them were composed by Manami Matsumae. I think that both of these tracks are really good, and despite not being composed by Jake Kaufman, I feel like Manami Matsumae did a really good job of making these two tracks fit the Shovel Knight style. And I always thought A Thousand Leagues Below was one of the best pieces of music that she's ever composed. So I'm not really the biggest fan of water levels and water level music, but this is some really good stuff. And Flowers of Antimony, I feel like it's kind of a banger, but there's also a bit of a vibe of mischief and maybe a little spooky in a way. I mean, not super spooky, but just a little tad bit spooky. And I'm sure that you can't mess with perfection, but I guess if there was one thing I would have liked was that there was maybe a few more Manami Matsume songs on the soundtrack, but these two tracks, I mean, they're really good. We're going to move on to our next block, and they consist of Courage Under Fire and Fighting with All of Our Might from the game Shovel Knight. tracks that you just heard. They were Courage Under Fire and Fighting with All of Our Might. As you progress through the game, you go to another village where you could buy some really cool armor that has different effects, and also an optional boss fight that's really cool. And I find the theme for the armor village to be pretty interesting, where it sounds like there's a lot of problems there, though the place is just as safe as the other village in the game. But it does lead to a really cool optional boss fight with Mr. Hat, who wants Shovel Knight's helmet. And that Fighting with All of Our Might is a really fun but energetic boss theme that's definitely pretty epic in sound, I would say. Definitely a good warm-up for the end game as you progress through the world map and towards the tower. And that for our next block, I'm going to play the themes for the last couple levels of the game, starting with the Fateful Return, and then I'm going to follow that up with the Inner Struggle. those two tracks that you just listened to, they were The Fateful Return, and then I followed that up with The Inner Struggle. Two wildly different tracks, but are very fitting together. And with The Fateful Return, you are approaching the tower, and as you're fighting your way through the rain, you have this music that is very confident and energetic, and it really motivates you to make your way through the level. And I think that it's a really good track. But I also like The Inner Struggle, where it's a bit less energetic, but you still kind of have this marching vibe to it. And that I really dig the subtle callbacks to the main theme, which makes perfectly sense since this is the last level in the game. And you will eventually be led into a boss rush with the various knights of the Order of No Quarter. Then after that, you will have a fight with the Enchantress, which that's going to pretty much be our next block. And that, just like classic NES games, the final boss has to have multiple forms. And with multiple forms means multiple pieces of music. So we're going to kick that off with the Possessor, followed by the Betrayer. And then we're going to end that block off with a Return to Order. those tracks that you just heard, they were The Possessor, followed by The Betrayer, and then we ended that block off with A Return to Order. And that was the soundtrack for Shovel Knight, a soundtrack that I think is very deserving of being inducted into the VGM Hall of Fame. And that at the time of recording, the game will be turning 11 this year, and at the time, I thought that soundtrack was pretty fire. But looking at it now, I think it really deserves to still be considered fire. And that Jake Kaufman did a hell of a job with the soundtrack, and Manami Matsumae with her contributions as well. And with that, we're going to play one more track, and it is the credits theme. So I just want to say congratulations to Shovel Knight for being inducted into the VGM Hall of Fame, and I hope you guys have a good one.